So it's a pleasure to be here tonight opening the talks. Thanks so much for coming, especially through the rain. It's been a bit dreary today, so it's great to be here. And I wanted to speak to you this evening about the beginnings of research ops at Monzo Bank. So some of you might already be familiar with Monzo and who we are and what we do, but for those of you who aren't, I wanted to do a quick bit of scene setting. So Monzo is an app-based bank, and it's been around for about 5 years now. And like many other organizations, we have lots of different obligations and goals and objectives that we want to achieve. And to give you a sense of my working environment, I wanted to highlight a few of those tonight. So first and foremost, we are a regulated bank, which means we need really solid compliance, solid governance, and the ability to react and change to regulation as and when needed. We also do our best to be customer-centric, and we strive to achieve our mission of making money work for everyone. And a couple of things that we do that are sort of quite linked to that. We maintain a public roadmap on our website, and that's fueled not only by our internal planning, but also by conversations we have with our community, both online on our forum and in person at events. And lastly, we've also gone through quite a serious growth spurt very recently. And to put that into context, when I joined Monzo in 2017, I was the 170th employee, and we now have over 1,300 staff members around the world. And we were also talking about 300,000 customers when I joined, and now we're speaking about over 3 million customers. So when you have all these different things sort of vying and jostling for your attention alongside your day-to-day and business as usual goals, how do you actually work effectively? How does that work? So for me, it comes down to actually working in an agile way. And I don't want to go into a sort of formal definition of what agile means, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for me, and throughout this presentation, when I speak about being agile, what I mean is a way of working that hinges on these three things. Hinges on adaptability, a focus on output, and on collaboration. And these three things, I think, are things that Monzo does really well as an organization generally, and they're things that I've tried to bring into my day-to-day and the way that I work in research operations. So, as for me, I've been at Monzo for 2.5 years now, thereabouts, and I joined as a COP, so that's what we call our customer service staff. Quickly moved into complaints handling from there, and then spent a lot of time in an operational role inside the complaints team itself. So that was looking at the systems that we use to sort of treat complaints and how we push the feedback from those back into the business to create change. And it was in June this year that I moved over to the design discipline to start setting up research operations. What actually is research operations? So first of all, I'm going to start referring to it as research ops from now on, just because I don't want to use up my whole time slot just repeating the same words, research operations. So research ops is essentially a scaling function of research. Its main goal is to create the ideal research environment for people doing research in your organization. It wants to make those people as effective and as impactful as possible. And the work of someone in research ops can touch anything from participant recruitment all the way through to the hardware you use to test with your participants. It can touch on things like data protection and confidentiality, and also on the tools and systems and ways that you communicate the findings and insights when you gather them. I'm even aware of research ops teams who actually look after the entire organization's research budget or help guide research strategy. So it's really quite far-reaching, and its focus will probably depend on the maturity of your organization. And quick show of hands, who recognizes Kate Towsey, the lady on the slide? I can see a few, that's great. If you aren't aware of her work, I definitely recommend checking it out online after tonight. She's the research ops lead at Atlassian, and she's done some really, really great work profiling people who do research ops, helping to define what research ops is. So highly recommend taking a look at what she does. So now you know a bit more about my environment, who I am, and what I do. I wanted to say a quick word on what I'm hoping you'll take away from my talk this evening. So first off, I wanted to share a lot of learnings from the first 4 months setting up research ops at Monzo. It's quite a unique position to be in, setting up a brand new function somewhere that's growing that quickly. And therefore, I also wanted to share a lot of tips on remaining agile when you're taking on this sort of project. And I'm also hoping if some of you are in a position where you're thinking about setting up your own research ops function, maybe get some ideas on places you could start or things you might want to do first. Great.
I'm just thinking that's because they can't.
Oh. Sorry, folks, over there. Is this better? Amazing. We've got some strong yeses. Perfect. So I am officially mic lady now. I have all the mics. So to get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the projects I'd sort of taken on in the first 4 months. And I'm going to present them as a bit of a story. And the point of this story is to illustrate that although it can be really tempting to take a lot of things on at once and try and solve all the problems all together, show of hands who's fallen into that trap before? It happens. That's what you get when you're enthusiastic. It's really important to remember that picking a priority will help you make progress, but you also need to remember to be flexible with that priority. You need to know when to change it to something different, and when you do change, there are supports you can rely on to help you make the right decisions about what to pick up next. So that's what I'm hoping this story will illustrate. So when I first started in the function, one of the first things I wanted to tackle was the way that we paid incentives to our participants. Now, the long and short is that we didn't have a way to pay the money directly into our participants' bank accounts. We were going through a third party to do that for us, which was taking up a little bit more time and using a bit more cost than it potentially could. So I was lucky enough to have some time working with a designer and an engineer, and we came up with a great solution that would allow us to pay the money directly into their bank accounts. We were really happy, and Alex, who was the engineer I was working with, had put together a technical proposal for this. And as we shared it out, people thought, yeah, this is a really good solution, but I was reminded of the fact that I had Alex working with me for about 5 hours every week, and it would take a very long time for this value to actually be presented back, seeing as the project was quite large. So this was a blocker, and this was the first blocker on the first project I took on. And as painful as it was for me to admit at the time, the best thing to do there was to kind of pivot and say, okay, how can we reshape this? How can we push this forward, but in a different way? Or do we look for something different? It ended up being the case that we looked for something slightly different. And one of the first supports I leaned on to help me do that was listening to my customers, who I consider my customers to be, the researchers, the research team at Monzo. So I was trawling through Slack, having a look at their messages that they'd been sending, and a theme that kept coming back again and again was that it could be easier to filter out previously used research participants when generating new user lists of people to reach out to for future projects. And what was happening was we were relying a lot on the data team to do this for us. There was a lot of lead time. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if the researchers could do this themselves? And I took this back to Alex, and we decided to work on this as the second project as our sort of collaboration continued. And we've now got an MVP in place to solve this problem. So had I not stopped when I was blocked, and had I not listened to my customers, this wouldn't have happened. So always good to keep that amount of flexibility in your work. Now, when the participant recruitment solution started sort of taking shape and going along nicely, I thought it's time to look again for something new. So what do I choose out of all these projects I could take on? So I decided to look at Monzo's organizational goals for guidance. And as I mentioned before, we've gone through a really big growth spurt. And that means that the processes that worked for us internally 6 months ago are now not working quite in the same way. So when I say processes, I mean things like onboarding suppliers, paying invoices, all those sorts of things that keep a business going in sight. So lots of parts of the business are sort of scaling up their processes, scaling up their solutions to match our new size. And I thought, actually, research could probably do with some of this as well. We work with lots of vendors, we use lots of tools, let's take a look at that. And I decided to do this and rely on the business to kind of show me what to choose next. So that's another support that's great to use. And so to my first learning, swapping priorities or being adaptable will lead to more success in the long run. And this is because you won't be spending time stuck on blockers, and you'll be supported by your customers and by your organization to prioritize and choose the best things to be working on. And so thinking about this supplier project that I took on most recently, I think this has been a really powerful place to start at Monzo in particular. And that's because it's had a really big impact quite quickly. And I like to think of it in my head as a big win project. It's a bit of an officey term, but it will do. And the reason it's had a big impact is because it's not only felt within the research discipline, but also within design as a whole, and within the teams who are kind of working to build up their processes as well. So people in security, in contracts, in finance. I'm working with all those teams to put this over the line. And I think no matter what field of work you're in, these big win projects are out there, and they're the ones that really help you make impact and make a good impression, and sort of drive something forward that helps a lot of people. And I wanted to use the supplier project as an example to illustrate what the characteristics of those big win projects are. And so, as I mentioned before, this supplier project is really nicely aligned with a wider organizational goal in Monzo. And what this means is that I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of help to kind of get this project wrapped up. And I think one of the key elements of a big win project is that you do have help to get this over the line. You have people by your side wanting to achieve the same goal. So that's something to look out for. Another thing that's been really nice about this project is that we've had the opportunity to take a step back and look at what contracts we have in place with people. And given the size we are now, we've had the opportunity to consider enterprise agreements, which are always great because they're cost effective. They give you access to useful things like priority support or maybe API keys. But for us, something that's been really important is having added data protection, because we can renegotiate our terms and get the protection that we need in place. And with one supplier in particular, once this agreement has been sorted out and signed, what it will actually do will enable us to outsource research projects in the future, because it will be far easier to do that, because the people we work with will be able to use our system, the data will be kept within our remit, within the terms that we've agreed. So again, another characteristic of a big win project is that it will unblock you for future projects and sort of tee you up for further work that you want to do in other places. And also with this project, I think it's one of those things that isn't the most sort of sexy to talk about. It's a little bit process driven. It may come across a little bit dry. But for me, when I think about the vision of this project and what it's going to deliver, that's what makes me really happy. So the idea of it is that every person doing research in Monzo will know exactly who we work with, exactly who they can bring in, at what point of their research project. They'll know exactly how to access the tools, how to use them, and they won't have to worry about paying for anything if a plan isn't upgraded, which are all kinds of blockers that we're coming up against at the moment. So everything will effectively be seamless. And that's what makes me really excited. And it also means that this project is, in effect, enabling others to help themselves. And I think that's another great characteristic of these types of projects to look out for. Oops, I didn't realize I was doing that. And so my second learning already spoiled it for myself, but locating big wins will allow you to make a larger impact faster. And to identify those big wins, you can look for projects that are aligned with your organizational goals, that you have helped to carry across the line, that set you up for other projects in the future. So they're effectively like killing two birds with one stone. And that they're also sort of enabling others to help themselves. So the slide you've already seen. What does it mean? Staying with the notion of self-help and enabling others to do better. The thing with research ops is that it's a supporting function and a helping function. And as such, if you are a person in this function, you'll often be approached with sort of ad hoc requests for help. And it's up to you, really, what you decide to do with these requests. So you have the opportunity to take a step back and think, what's in the balance here? How can I actually approach this in the best way to make sure that I'm staying focused on delivering really solid outputs that are driving towards sort of operational efficiency. And I wanted to take the opportunity in this presentation to talk through what some of those trade-offs and some of those balancing acts might be. So let's take an example. Let's imagine that you've just set up a brand new research ops function. And you have a researcher friend who comes to you and they say, hey, wouldn't do this normally, but I'm really, really slammed this week and I need some help. I need 6 participants with this criteria. Can you please, please, please work with this agency and just sort it out for me this one time? I'll never ask again. And you think, okay, fine, I'll help you with this. And then 2 weeks later, the friend comes back again and asks you the same favor. So you say yes again, because it's harder to say yes. It's harder to say no a second time. And eventually you're doing this sort of work for lots of other people who do research across your organization. And although you will have a lot of good friends and you'll be very liked, this doesn't necessarily have lots of longevity. What you're essentially doing is bringing those existing operational inefficiencies and moving them onto your own plate. And that's not really what Research Ops is about. What you want to be doing is taking those requests for help and saying, I hear you, I understand this is really painful right now. But what I'd like to do is look at it in more depth, understand where the pain is, understand where the time loss is, and really help you fix that so we can make a solution that works for the long term. So that's one of the trade-offs you can consider. Do I help now in a very quick way, or do I spend a little bit more time and help later in a sort of more robust way? And this next part will depend on what your design organization looks like, but I'd imagine many of you work in a similar way to us at Monzo, where we have user researchers and also user experience designers embedded into product squads. So they work alongside their product manager and their developers to sort of bring about solutions together. And what this does is encourage design thinking with everybody inside that product squad. And it's geared towards producing better customer experiences and putting the customer first consistently. So this is obviously fantastic from a customer perspective and from a product output perspective, but it does make things a little bit tricky when you set up research ops, or so I found. So it's easy to approach this situation and say, I am research ops, I support everyone doing research. And that's true to an extent, but you do have to remember that your researchers and the people doing research in your organization are essentially 2 different groups of customers. So your researchers will probably take on more chunky pieces of research that take place over a slightly longer period of time. They might approach them in a slightly more systematic way with specialist tools and just generally share a similar approach. Whereas the further out you go from your core researchers to other people doing research in the organization, while they'll still be producing quality research because your principles will be guiding them to do the correct things in the right way, their actual processes might be slightly different and divergent. And they'll be doing research that's maybe slightly more iterative, things like pop-up testing or usability testing, just to validate sort of single flows and single concepts. So in fact, when you're looking to support people doing research, you're supporting people who are doing very different types of research. And you need to take that into account when you're designing solutions. And so another trade-off I'd probably suggest thinking about is whether you want to help a large group of people or a smaller group of people, and what you might gain from doing either of those 2 things. And as another point, once you have chosen your customer, so whether it's your core researchers or the people doing research in your organization, you want to always share with them early and often. And I think everybody says this at most sort of UX-based events, but it can never be taken for granted enough. I think when you work with people you respect, who do great work themselves, it can be really daunting to share something that's just really unfinished when you're still swimming in all the ambiguity. But by sacrificing some of that polish that you might desire to show them, you'll definitely be gaining in accuracy in the long term, which I think is a win. And so to my third learning, not sure if I went this far ahead before and you've already seen it. Making progress in research ops is about trade-offs and balance. And you can decide what kinds of trade-offs you want to make. They're all about when you help, who you help, and also how you help. And so to sort of recap the learnings together, I think it's so, so important when trying to work within an agile organization and to work in an agile way, always to put some emphasis on being adaptable and flexible, to always remember to focus on impact and outputs, and finally, to also collaborate with your customers, share with them early, share with them frequently, and sort of figure out the way to help them best together. So thank you so much for listening. You're more than welcome to connect with me outside of tonight, and I think we have time for questions.
Questions?
Just to clarify a little bit, so I was really excited to hear the way you're kind of embracing the whole research approach and sort of trying to build platforms that all your external consultants will use, so that you've got a sort of consistency in data. Are they literally grassroots up sort of built platforms, or what sort of things are you doing to achieve that, if you don't mind me asking?
No, of course. Can you all hear me? If I hold this closer, great, fantastic. So it's a mix of the two. It's really that kind of classic scenario of having lots of things that aren't on fire but could definitely be better. And so I only have limited resource in terms of engineering power. It's probably about 5 hours a week. So there are some that we're trying to build from the ground up. One thing in particular is that participant piece, and I think building a participant database is going to be one of the first things that we try and tackle, because it is the foundation of actually being able to do lots of other types of things, like the incentives project that needs the participant database to be in place to work. So that's one of the things we'll take on ourselves. However, we are looking at sort of interim solutions for the incentives payments that we might use third parties. So we'd probably work on a model of outsourcing for the interim and then building ourselves in the long term. That tends to be how Monzo's worked for lots of different areas of its development.
So that when you talk about the database, is that so you can cherry pick the right people for each type of research?
So it's about cherry, because obviously in banking in particular, there are sort of things you want to respect, and customers that will be more or less suitable for different types of research. So we definitely want to be sort of contacting the correct people, but it's also about being able to sort of have preferences and things like that in place. So if somebody is really happy to be contacted on a fairly frequent basis, we know we can reach out to them without sort of worrying them, or vice versa. If someone only wants to be contacted once every year, then we'll leave it at that. All those sorts of things.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. I think there's a question at the front as well. Oh, sorry.
My question is not actually about the Agile, but more about the Monzo. I know that the Monzo has done some update, quite big update, like late September. I wonder whether you've done any empirical, like a user research after you released that big update.
Yes, good question. So I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think what you're referring to is the new navigation.
Yep.
So we've changed, for those of you who maybe don't use Monzo, we did a bit of a layout change inside the Monzo app itself and moved things around, updated it. The idea of it was to improve discoverability of features and to sort of have a bit more flow to the app. And we have done some testing since. I think we've done 3 or 4 rounds of usability testing since. We've made a few tweaks based on it, and there are still things that we want to change and make better. And obviously we are working on new products all the time as well, so that feeds into that testing, and we need to work out where there's going to be space for those new products alongside what we already have. So I think you can probably expect some changes, but I can't share too much about what the findings are at this point, but we have been testing and we'll continue to do so.
Right, because I'm actually a huge fan of Monzo, and it's one of the best apps I've ever used. It's brilliant. It changed the way I use my finance or controlling my budget. For that reason, I was so excited when I heard the update, and then once the update was done, actually, the new navigation system was quite confusing for me. And I was thinking about the case of Facebook, for instance. Do you remember the Facebook has changed their posting system a few years ago, and a lot of people find it quite frustrating because they got so used to with the first, the posting system and familiar with them. When the change was made, people just was not happy. I think eventually Facebook reverted back to the previous kind of like a frame. You planning quite similar thing, or could similar thing can happen, or yeah?
So I completely hear you, and I think that is something we've had, and I think the analogy we've been using internally is that it's almost like someone's come into your living room and moved all your furniture around, and now it's just weird. So we are aware of that sentiment being present amongst some of our customers, and we do want to try and tackle that and do further testing to investigate why that is. One of the other things that has come up as a big theme is do you remember the pulse graph that was at the top of the app? I don't know if anyone's seen that. It allowed you to see where you were sort of this time last month financially compared to this month. A lot of people are actually really missing the pulse graph, which we didn't, you included, which we didn't expect at all. So we're looking at ways that we can bring that specific value back into the app. So I don't think, while we probably wouldn't do a flip reverse to go back to what we did before, I think that's off the cards. I think we will work on it to get back what customers now feel is missing.
Any more questions?
Hi, yeah. I just wondered, is it ever an issue for you? Well, it is an issue for me, but serial market research participants. So where I was working before, the participants, so we were using an external agency, and we were finding that a lot of the participants, even though we thought we'd screened them out, they were like these serial participants who kind of, as soon as they entered the room, they were like, okay, shall I talk out loud? So I'm and before you could stop them, before you could actually set them almost the task, they were just off and talking. And yeah, do you have any, is that an issue for you? And do you have any tips on kind of how to really screen out people who are these serial participants who are just kind of in it for the money, basically?
That's a good question, and it's something I have seen in kind of research ops community conversations around and about. It's not something we've really experienced firsthand at the moment, particularly with when we recruit internally. It's really not happened at all. I think where the risk of that happening comes up a little bit more is when we do go through agencies, if we're sort of not looking to gain insight from people who already use Monzo. So we're just maybe looking at wider sort of mental models around finance and things like that. That's where things like that have sort of appeared a little bit more. I would say something that's useful is to kind of just really get to know your agencies well, develop a really strong sort of contact within there, and just also understand actually what they do to get to more remote areas of the country as well. I don't know what type of research you're doing, but if you're looking for people from all over, sometimes agencies actually use other third parties to get access to people in more remote locations. And sometimes, I don't know how that happens, but maybe their processes aren't quite so robust and people are maybe finding it easier to get past screeners and things like that. So I would sort of just have a really good relationship and have those open conversations about why it might be happening.
I think we have time for one more question. Sure.
Hi. You talk a lot about different project prioritization and stuff like this. So let's say you done your piece of research and you think there is amazing feature that business should implement or work on further. What is the process from actually this idea that this is something to follow to actually getting it to developers? I mean, who do you go to sign it off, to convince, and who's got the last say whether you work on it or not?
Thank you. So it really depends on what's going on at the time. It sounds like it may be a bit of a vague answer, but Monzo has, as a way of working, we quite favor a written proposal, and they don't have to be long, just something that sort of points out the core issues that we have, what we might gain from fixing them, a suggestion of how it could potentially be fixed. One that is shared at a good time, like let's say, for example, thinking about organizational goals again and thinking about maybe the idea of being in control or sort of a focus on like governance or compliance. If that's sort of like the vibe at the time, that's a really good time to push out something where you might have an internal tool that has some bugs and you really want them fixed, because people will be more attentive to that sort of messaging when it's already being drilled into them from elsewhere. So that's kind of the principle I work on at the moment. In terms of sign-off, I think I'm lucky in the respect that we're fairly flat as an organisation, and that if an idea is picked up, it will usually just be worked on without too much resistance. But I'm sure that will change in time, and be a new thing to get my head around. But yeah.
So thank you so much, Kim. I think we're going to take about a 15-minute break now, enjoy some refreshments and some snacks, and we'll make an announcement when we're back ready to start with our next speaker, who is Mary McPherson from Lloyds Bank. Thank you.